Okay, so Civil War, Reconstruction, we get to the year 1861. The War of Northern Aggression begins. Why is it called the War of Northern Aggression, and by whom? Of course, you can kind of figure this out. Many in the South and the Confederacy at the time felt that the Union was being aggressive, that they were being unjust in their actions, and that this war was about Union aggression or Northern aggression. Now, this reflects the myth, the Southern myth that continues even to this day, the idea of the lost cause, which we will discuss more as the term develops. But for many in the South, again, the blame is on the North, and the lost cause, of course, goes along the lines of we could have won, we just didn't have the manpower or the industry or the money, et cetera, et cetera. Focusing on the ideals, of course, of the South. Now, as we get to the first true battle of the war, Fort Sumter, I just want to point out ahead of time that this is the perfect example of Lincoln's political pragmatism, of his political cunning, and I will talk about a few things he does in 1861 that really lead to the Union taking the high ground, at least for part of it. Lincoln also makes some decisions that are absolutely undemocratic, un-American, and unconstitutional, but you can decide for yourself, was this legitimate? Was this justified because of the war? Again, it absolutely reflects Lincoln's political pragmatism, whether you're a fan of Lincoln or not. And believe me, there are many who criticize him. Again, he really strengthened the federal government. He took actions that were outside of the scope of the president. And he was looked at, before he was elected as a dangerous man, much as we would see with Reagan and, of course, our current president. So let's get to Fort Sumter. As far as the two sides, again, we have the Confederacy, we have the Union. Pierre Gustave Beauregard led the charge, if you will, for the Confederacy. Major Robert Anderson was the commander for the Union. The governor of South Carolina was James Pickens. Again, this is recognized as the first actual battle. 68 federal troops were stationed in Charleston. They withdrew to Fort Sumter, an island in Charleston Harbor, on December 25th, 1860. The North, or the Union, believed this to be its property. Of course, the Confederacy thought it belonged to them. It was in South Carolina, after all. Robert Anderson was commander at Sumter, as I mentioned. He was actually from the South. He had Southern sympathies, and he even had slaves, but he remained loyal to the Union. He realized that Moultrie was indefensible. The rooftops, for example, protruded from the tops of the walls. He moved everyone to Sumter in the middle of the night, again, to protect them, and this was a surprise to many. 6,000 South Carolina militia, on the other hand, would cut Sumter off from their supplies. In January of 1861, President James Buchanan makes one last attempt to bridge the divide, realizing that Anderson and his men were cut off from their supplies. The president sent 200 soldiers and supplies on an unarmed merchant vessel entitled the Star of the West to reinforce Anderson. It departed, and when it departed, South Carolina artillery would start to fire on it, which of course made this problematic to say the least. Jefferson Davis, the new president of the Confederacy, sent a group to the capital to negotiate the transfer of Sumter to the Confederate States of America. He would, of course, be denied. South Carolina Governor James Pickens demands the Union and Anderson surrender. Fort Sumter is running out of supplies. It needs assistance. Lincoln is in a quandary. He did not want to appear as the aggressor. He did not want to antagonize Southern states, not in the Confederacy, the border states, for example. Remember, the Confederacy is still growing at this time, and Lincoln has to be careful not to step on their toes, not to lead them to join the Confederacy. He needs Kentucky, for example. He needs Maryland. So, again, he has to kind of tiptoe around the issue. March 5th, 1861, Anderson asks Lincoln if he can leave the area. Lincoln denies him. He considers it a concession that would show weakness. Over a month later, on the 6th of April, Lincoln contacted Governor Pickens, told him that he was going to send supplies to Sumter. No arms, no troops, no ammunition, just basic supplies. Davis, of course, could not let this happen. He would begrudgingly become the aggressor. He demanded that Anderson surrender, but he would not. Now, what about the press? A couple weeks ago, one of the questions was, war is a terrible thing. Why did each side want to go to war? One example would be the stoking of the fires. The media Adding to this, they pushed for war. Southern newspaper writer J.G. Gilchrist warned, quote, "Unless you sprinkle the blood in the face of the people of Alabama, they will be back in the old Union in less than 10 days." Again, what does this mean? To truly invest, you need to see the carnage. You need to know that the Union wanted war. You needed to know that the Union wanted to destroy your livelihood, and only such an attack would fully get them on board. April 12th, 1861, the Civil War begins. 3.5 days of shelling of the fort, the actual shelling. Anderson would surrender. He did not have troops to go to the top tier where their heaviest artillery was. He kept them below in safety. Some men would eventually go up, start using their artillery against Anderson's orders. Eventually, the Union flag is shot down, surrender is demanded, and acceded to. Confederacy under Beauregard at Sumter. One notable thing, he actually studied under Anderson at West Point, and this would be a gentlemanly battle, if you will. There were no deaths until the 100-gun salute after the surrender, which is a sad bit of irony. Now, what about Anderson? Again, he is in control of Sumter. He is a Southerner. He calls for Lincoln to let him leave over a month prior to the actual surrender. But how would he be received in the North? After the surrender, he and the remainder of his troops would head to New York City, where they were met by large crowds who considered him a hero for his efforts. Even the press deemed him a hero. The New York City press, that did not support Lincoln during the election and had been staunchly anti-Lincoln since the inauguration, described him as gallant, brave, a thing to thank God for. Portraits of Anderson went for 25 cents, which was no small sum at the time. Why was he heroic? First of all, he fought valiantly until realizing either keeping the fight going or retreating were untenable. Second, he negotiated terms of surrender to not disgrace himself or his soldiers. He would not surrender his sword or the flag, the latter, of course, becoming quite important later. And he did not succumb to fear or passion, always maintaining a cool and dignified demeanor. Anderson would speak to a crowd of thousands in Union Square. What was called a monster meeting, as the Chamber of Commerce called it, was organized by both Republicans and Democrats. The flag that flew at Sumter, again, he would not let it go. He held on to it, and it would fly from George Washington's statue in the square. Torn, tattered, but still surviving, very symbolic of the gesture. A city which had criticized Lincoln and his efforts now suddenly switched gears. They would support his call for more troops, for example. Most important, though, one could argue, was that what George Templeton Strong stated when he said, quote, "We began to look like a unified North." This is important. Prior, there was little interest, and those who were interested flagellated between support and criticism. There was no consensus support for Lincoln's action or the war when it started, but upon surrendering at Fort Sumter, not only did Anderson become a hero, the North as a whole began to show its support and finally get behind the effort. Surrender had become a bad word over the years, and even by the end of the Civil War, it was deemed un-American. But at this point, honorary surrender was recognized and appreciated. Even the press in the South offered admiration and praise for Anderson, recognizing that he had little chance of winning. What did I mention? 68 versus 6,000. Again, they recognized he had little chance of winning, yet he kept up the good fight until he realized it was no longer feasible. The Charleston Courier, for example, called him, quote, "the gallant Anderson." The Richmond Daily Examiner quoted the, quote, "highest honor and credit on the gallant major in command and the noble and of heroes." Anderson became a hero in the North, promoted to brigadier general. He is credited with keeping Kentucky in the Union. It's a completely different part of this story. He would be present the next time the Union's flag was raised over Fort Sumter. No spoilers here. The Union wins the Civil War. South Carolina militia had taken over federal offices and buildings during this time. Other Southern armies had taken similar entities throughout the South. The big question, of course, who starts the battle? Lincoln, again, I think this is a perfect example of his political cunning. He did not want to seem the aggressor, so he sent the supplies, knowing that Davis, Beauregard, Pickens could not accept that they would probably fire on him. And later, Lincoln told a friend his plan for sending supplies to Major Anderson and claimed that it had, quote, succeeded. Quote, "They attacked Sumter, it fell, and thus did more service than it otherwise could." And this is true. Sumter really did not have much strategic value for the Union, but again, it was symbolic. And if he had given it up, obviously it would have been a terrible concession from the Union standpoint. Now, did Lincoln have to push this issue? Could he have allowed the Southern states to secede? Why did he initiate the conflict? He believed that secession was unconstitutional. In his July speech, he would state that the war, quote, is a people's contest, a struggle for maintaining in the world that form and substance of government which leading object is whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men. Now, this is important for many reasons. First, Lincoln is calling this war part of the larger American historical mission. Think back to John Winthrop, his ideal of a city upon a hill, the society that other nations would look to as the ideal. This was also part of the idea of manifest destiny, as coined by John O'Sullivan. Again, this was the nation's destiny, its purpose, its responsibility to spread democratic and republican values. Responsibility is a key term when we think of both Winthrop and his City Upon a Hill and O'Sullivan and his ideas on manifest destiny. For Lincoln, this war is about maintaining this mission. If the Union were to dissipate, this mission would also end. The mission of the Union thus trumped any type of schism, and for the sake of the nation and more importantly for the world, the Union and its ideals must be kept together. Consensus historians speak of the history of America as one of inevitable progress. For Lincoln, secession would have interrupted and ended this progress, and he would not allow it. Now, one question often pondered was how Lincoln could have avoided war. This, I know, is a question in survey courses. Could the Civil War have been avoided? One possibility would have been the Anaconda Plan. Now, this was a plan created by General Winfield Scott, who was then the general-in-chief. Of course, Lincoln would go through many, kind of like Steinbrenner and his many managers when he was in charge of the Yankees in the 70s and 80s. But what was the Anaconda Plan? The goal of this was to cut off the Confederate States of America by blockading the Gulf and the Atlantic, thereby cutting off access to the Mississippi in an attempt to force the South to give up. Scott believed that the temperament of the Southern people, as well as their patriotism, would lead them to ultimately realize they were wrong and return to the fold. This was a strategy based not on battles and invasion, but patience, by slowly strangling the South into submission. Now, this is key when we look at why it was not followed, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. For Scott, this was about a peaceful action, somewhat peaceful, but it was not about going to war. It was not about battling. It was not about shedding blood. It was about preventing that. This was essentially a diplomatic solution, if you will. A little bit, not necessarily diplomatic as we might think of it in the traditional sense, but this was an effort to stop the war. Many Union generals, in fact, felt it was too passive, that it would have taken too long. They wanted to go in and attack the CSA and bring it to its knees. Per the Jomini Plan, Jomini, probably mispronounced that, a European military strategist whose ideas were followed by generals in both the Union and the Confederacy. Jomini's plans were, or Jomini's strategy was taught at West Point. And so all of the generals learned the same strategy. But anyway, according to this plan, they wanted to go in, go straight for the capital, take it, and force the Confederacy to surrender. This would also theoretically prevent the Confederacy from doing business with Europe. Scott's plan included 4 regions, with the 60,000-man army supported by gunboats to travel the Mississippi to New Orleans in order to split the Confederacy in half and cut off shipments between West and East. Now, this will all return. When we get to 1863, this plan would finally come to fruition. Unfortunately, it's in the middle of war, and it was not about preventing bloodshed, but we'll get there. Sorry, need the Diet Dew there. Politicians and media types would criticize this plan as weak. They would give it the name Anaconda. The belief, again, was that the war would be short. The Union held myriad advantages, and rather than waiting it out, why not just go for the jugular and get it over with? Again, this plan will come back in 1863. In a way, though, again, much bloodier than what Scott had anticipated. April 15th, 1861, shortly after Sumter, Lincoln issues a proclamation calling for 75,000 militiamen, summoning a special session of Congress for July 4th. What's notable about this request was that it was to be a 90-day enlistment, 3 months. Now, you can look at this a number of ways. Obviously, though, the key, Lincoln, like everybody else, thought this would be a short war, that they could get it over with quickly, and that thus we'd only need them for 90 days. He was a bit overconfident, as was the entirety of the Union, to be sure, due to their numerous advantages. But this short enlistment only, again, further proves the point. of his overconfidence, and again, really of the kind of the naivete on both sides. Each side thought it would be a short war. The same day that he issues that, a gentleman named Robert E. Lee, a 25-year distinguished veteran of the U.S. Army and former superintendent at West Point, is offered command of the Union Army. He declines. Now, why would he spurn Lincoln's offer? He's a 25-year veteran of the American military. He was a Virginian, and many at the time still associated themselves with their state. And this will change really after the Civil War. Instead of people being Carolinians, instead of people being Virginians, instead of people being Georgians, New Yorkers, etc., we became Americans. This war, that's one of the impacts that we see is less focused really on the sections on one's individual state. And for Lee, again, he considers himself a Virginian. And he was fearful that he would be forced to invade his home state at some point if he took the title. He would ultimately resign his commission in the U.S. Army, quote, "I cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, my children," and would be given command of the military and naval forces of Virginia. Now, Lee was not a big supporter of slavery nor of secession initially. And there are many nuances to these people in our past. This is why, as a historian, of course, one should be troubled by the toppling of statues. They're part of our history. We cannot ignore our history, whether we like it or we don't. And one wonders in 100, 150 years, are the statues of people that we appreciate and acknowledge, are they going to be toppled for other reasons? Something to consider. But Lee, again, was he was a nuanced individual, and he needs to be recognized as that. Too often we look at these issues in black and white, right or wrong, Manichean, if you will. It's not that simple. Lee is, again, a perfect example of this. 2 days after Lee would resign, Virginia would, in fact, secede, joining the previous states. Within 5 weeks, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina would also secede, thus forming an 11-state confederacy with a population of 9 million. The Union, 21 states, and a population of 20 million. Notably, we see 4 slave states stay in the Union. Maryland, we'll get to that in a little bit, Kentucky, Delaware, and Missouri. We also see the creation of a new state, West Virginia. Residents of the western counties of Virginia did not wish to secede with the rest of the state. This section of Virginia would be admitted into the Union as the state of West Virginia in June of 1863. One of the keys for these other states joining was Lincoln's call for more military. After Sumter, they felt that he had overstepped his bounds. But still, again, he held on to some key states because of his political pragmatism. Lincoln took action April 19th, issuing a proclamation of blockage against southern ports, thereby limiting the ability of the rural South to stay well supplied during the war. Why is this important, other than the obvious reason of strategy? In essence, Lincoln was recognized the Confederacy as a belligerent. Notable because up to this time, he did not recognize Confederate independence, and he never truly would. But this official action reflected, and indeed showed, that he did recognize their quasi-independence. European nations had already stated that they would not recognize the Union Declaration that southern ports were closed to trade. Indeed, the interaction between Europe and the States would not cease to exist. Those in Europe practiced a great deal of commerce with the Confederate States and needed to continue to do so regardless of the war. And of course, these states needed to be able to trade with Europe for survival. The only way to prevent this trade from continuing, which would allow the Confederacy to remain economically viable as well as prevent unofficial recognition from Europe for the Confederacy, was to blockade these southern ports. Thus, Lincoln's action. In May, the Confederate States of America moved its capital from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. This was partially due to the fact Virginia had finally seceded, but also because this was a better, richer city, and it was much closer to D.C. and the Union's capital. Remember the Jomini strategy: go after your opponent's capital, take it down. In May of 1861, we began to see the use of the term contraband of war. This was the name given for escaped or fugitive slaves taken in by the Union. Often these folks would literally run to the front, enter Union camps in an attempt to escape their slavery. Initially, they would be returned. There are many stories of this. People or military leaders who kind of vacillated. Do we keep them? Do we protect them? Do we let them go? And initially, again, they were returned by beginning... But this would begin to change per General Benjamin Butler and his decision to use this term and to not return them. Why? Butler reasoned that the Confederacy had left the Union, so the Union was not bound to support it, nor continue any policies that were in place prior to the war, as these states were now enemy combatants. Spot on, General Butler. He nailed it there. And this is kind of an unintended consequence, right, of the Confederacy declaring war. This is a common sense answer to the question. Logistically, this, of course, also meant that these fugitives could be put to work for the Union. And arguably more important, a large part of the Confederate workforce would be taken away. Now, we're going to see more of this, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation and its declaration. We see how this would directly support the Union Army, because after the Emancipation Proclamation, fugitive slaves can now take up arms. That is huge, right? But it also meant those who left the lines to gain their freedom, that took away an important source of work, of labor for the Confederacy. So it really was a double whammy, if you will. Now, we also, in 1861, have Lincoln performing arguably the most controversial act of his presidency. I had mentioned undemocratic, unconstitutional. We're going to get to that right here. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. This would expand in 1862 and actually become a war act in 1863. Specifically, he does this in Maryland. Of course, the writ of habeas corpus, if you are placed in jail, you can demand that you be tried immediately. Maryland was key to the war. That's oversimplification, of course, but gives you an idea. Now, let's get to where did this happen? Why is it more important? Maryland was a key to the war. The only lines for overland supplies, troop movements, transportation, and communication to D.C. ran through Maryland, with the railroad running through Baltimore. Notably, in February, Baltimore rowdies had forced President-elect Lincoln to sneak through the city in disguise. And a mob attacked the 6th Massachusetts Regiment as it marched through Baltimore on its way to Washington. There were many Confederate sympathizers in Maryland. They were organized and they were violent. The Maryland legislature met April 26th. Lincoln would monitor this. He would arrest many of the members of the legislature. Why is this important? Because if the legislature at that point had voted to secede and join the Confederacy, the Union could potentially be in trouble for some of the reasons listed above. Furthermore, Maryland was seen as the key. For Lincoln, he believed that Kentucky and Maryland were essential for the Union. If he had not imprisoned these members of the legislature, they may have indeed voted to join the Confederacy, and that would have completely changed the game. April 27th, Lincoln issues an order to General Scott authorizing him to suspend the writ of habeas corpus at or near any military line between Philadelphia and Washington if the public safety required it. Now, Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says, quote, "The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion and invasion the public safety may require it." Maybe it was constitutional in that context. Many at the time did not believe it so. Many scholars since then believe that he took liberties. John Merryman was a state legislator in Maryland. He was arrested for attempting to hinder Union troops from moving from Baltimore to Washington during the war. He also recruited, trained, and led a drill company for Confederate service. He would be held at Fort McHenry by Union military officials. His attorney sought the writ of habeas corpus so that a federal court could examine the charges. Lincoln again suspended this right, though, and the general in command at McHenry refused to turn him over to authorities. Federal Judge Roger Taney, certainly you remember him, issued a ruling that Lincoln did not have the authority to suspend habeas corpus, that per the Constitution, this was the duty of Congress, not the president. I had mentioned earlier, hey, that looks constitutional. Maybe it wasn't. Lincoln, of course, ignored Taney, and in his July 4th speech, and remember, Taney is in the Supreme Court for the Union, right? Lincoln ignored him and in his July 4th speech would defend himself, insisting that some rules or laws must be suspended for the sake of war. I'm going to leave you with that, and I want you to think about that. Is that legitimate? If we are in a war, is it okay to suspend laws? Is it okay to suspend rights that were deemed inalienable by our founders? Maybe you believe Lincoln did what he needed to do to win. Maybe you believe that Lincoln overstepped his bounds. But something to consider. I will provide a second video lecture on 1861 shortly.